Today's lecture is on Northern and Southern Africa. When we talk about Africa, as you can see in the slide here, we're talking about a really large continent that has several different climate zones. And as we've learned in this class, climate plays a huge role in what grows there and what types of food the people eat. And so for this lecture, we're going to be talking about Northern Africa and Southern Africa. And the majority of Northern Africa, as you can see, is either desert or semi-desert. And with the very northern part of Africa being a Mediterranean climate, since it borders the Mediterranean. And then if we look at the south, it's a little bit more mixed. So we've got some desert, some semi-desert, we've got grasslands, we've got a little bit of Mediterranean climate, and even a bit of forested area. So in terms of climate, there's a little bit more of a variety of foods that you're going to find in the south than you're going to find in the north. So we're going to start our discussion in Northern Africa, and we're going to be focusing primarily on the countries that you see here, Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, Libya, and Egypt. Some of the earliest world civilizations were located in the area of Africa, and particularly in Northern Africa around Egypt. The earliest North African civilizations dated from about 10,000 BC, and that long ago the land was different. Climate change is something that is not a new phenomenon. It's something that we've seen over and over again in the history of the world in different areas. But in Northern Africa, the land was not always desert, and in fact we know that there was herding activity at this time, and where you have herded animals such as cattle, they needed something to feed on, which was grassland. So in this area there is some evidence that there was herding activity with animals such as cattle during this time, and over time, as this area, Northern Africa, became more desert, what happened was people that were originally hunter-gatherers, they would just walk around and find different food sources, gathered more toward the water, because obviously where there's more water, there's more food. And so the Nile River was an area, and this is the area you can see highlighted on the map, the area of the Nile River, was much more fertile. And what happened is that people stopped wandering around trying to find food and realized that they could grow their own food in areas where they had reliable water and good land, and that's what happened. So the population that had been more spread out migrated more toward the river, and agriculture began in the area. So that was the active planting of different crops such as wheat and chickpeas and those sorts of things. And the thing about the Nile River is that it flooded very predictably every year. And so what happened during those floods is that it would flood the land, but it would bring a new layer of rich soil to replenish the areas that had been farmed. And so it was a really good system to produce a lot of food that could feed a lot of mouths as the population grew. So where you have a lot of people and you have a lot of reliable food to feed all of those people, that's when civilizations are born. So when we say civilization, we talk about things like rules and laws and authority and just different aspects of governing a large group of people, and how to act and how to behave. So that is civilization, and that's something that grew up as a direct consequence of the reliable farming and the increasing population. The indigenous peoples of North Africa are called the Berbers, And over time, the Berbers mixed with a lot of other peoples from across the Mediterranean and Western Asia. During the 7th century, Muslims overtook North Africa, and so there was a significant mixing in terms of culture and peoples. And so that's why today the majority of Berbers in the area identify as Sunni Muslim. And of course, along with that, that conquest came foodways. And so a lot of Northern Africa has very similar food traditions to the Middle East, and that's the reason for that. The other thing is that North Africa also, because the very northern part of it is along the Mediterranean, and there was active trade routes going through the area via camel caravan. There were a lot of goods moving back and forth from Asia and from different countries in the Mediterranean, including Greece. And because of that, whenever you have trade, you have a lot of mixing of foodways and cultural ideas and religious ideas and those sorts of things. And so what happened is that North Africa is really sort of a big mix of not only Middle Eastern traditions, but Greek traditions and other Mediterranean traditions that all mix together, and when combined with native foods in North Africa, sort of became its own thing. So continuing from the last slide, if we look at this map here and focus on Northern Africa, you can see that beyond the Muslims, North Africa has been sort of a mixing of other cultures. As I had mentioned, the Greeks, Phoenicians, Romans, the Ottoman Empire, which came much later. So, all of these came through and ruled the area in succession, and each time a new group came in, they left more of their food and religion and medicine habits, which kind of came along and mixed together into the culture that we know today. Much later, the 19th and 20th century, there was essentially a European land grab of all of Africa, and we'll talk a little bit more about this as we go on, but primarily the picture that you see here on the slide represents European control of different parts of Africa. And you can see that in the north, the French had quite a bit of control over northwestern Africa, which is why today in many African countries, French is the official language. Like Tunisia, many of them speak French, and that's why, because of French colonization. The Italians had a bit of a grab on Libya, and we'll talk more about that when we get to East Africa, because you can see there was Italian representation there. British were in control of Egypt and farther south, and you'll see the Germans, and they're more in South Africa, which we'll talk about in a bit. And then some Spanish influence you see there in Morocco. There's a heavy influence there in terms of language and architecture and food and things like that in Morocco and very farther in West Africa. So the Europeans also left their mark. So again, not only in foodways, but also in language and culture and architecture and those sorts of things. So you see that Africa is really, as a whole, really kind of a big mixture of not only native culture, but many outside influences over the centuries and millennia. Turning to worldview, we'll start with religion. And as I had mentioned, the vast majority of North Africa is Muslim. And again, part of that is because of that that control by the Muslims of North Africa in the 7th century. And you can see on this map that roughly 70 to 100% of people in North Africa are Muslim, and it gets less as you go farther down south, and that's because there was a heavier European concentration and settlement in South Africa, and we'll get to that. So vast majority, as I had mentioned previously, North African Muslims are Sunni Muslim. And so because of that, food and eating traditions related to Islam are widely practiced. So halal concepts and then the following of Ramadan is also important in North Africa. It's not real surprising then, with all of this cultural mixing, that the North African cuisine is this mix of not only traditional and indigenous food traditions, but with all of these other ingredients that were brought from elsewhere. So if we look at wheat, that's something that is indigenous and had been grown. The Berber people invented couscous. If you've ever had that, couscous is kind of like it's pasta really, that is just kind of ground. It's sort of a granular kind of couscous, and it can be used in place of rice and those sorts of things. But that's native to the area. But then you add ingredients from the Mediterranean, lemons and olives, a lot of foods that were brought in from the New World after the 1500s, so things like peppers and chilies and tomatoes and things like that, and then different spices that were brought in from the Middle East and from South Asia and all those trade routes that went through North Africa. A lot of spices that weren't indigenous to the area came through as well and became used in a lot of the in the dishes of the area. Core foods, wheat, as I mentioned, couscous is real common. Breads, flatbreads, as you see in the Middle East, real common throughout the area. Secondary foods include things like seafood, because of course a lot of North Africa is bordered by the sea, so you see a lot of seafood, a lot of fish. Goat, lamb, beef, nuts are really common throughout the area. Complementary foods, as we were talking about, preserved lemons, spices, harissa, which is kind of a spicy sauce that's made with chilies and spices and those sorts of things. It's used on a lot of different foods and real common in the area. If you look at North African cuisine in sort of an east-west way, there are a few differences that we'll mention here. If you look at the northwestern corner of North Africa, so those are countries like Morocco and Algeria and in there, that's referred to as the Maghreb region. And the differences there are that there's heavy French, Italian, Spanish influences. Couscous is extremely common in those areas, a little more so than on the eastern side. In the picture you see tagine, which is tagine is a cooking method. You see the pot there that has sort of that domed lid to it, and what that does is it helps steam the food that's inside and kind of concentrate the cooking liquid, and making for a very flavorful dish of whatever is cooking in there, whether it's chicken or seafood or whatever the case may be. That's much more common on that western side. So tagine is referred not only to the pot, but also whatever's cooking inside. So it might be like a chicken tagine. The Maghreb is the area where the Berber people had a much heavier concentration, much more so than on the east side. And so there's some Berber indigenous cultural influences as well, particularly the couscous, since they're the ones that invented that. You see that more so in the western end. On the eastern end, it's a little bit dominated more by Egyptian cuisine. There's a very, very heavy Middle Eastern influence there than there is in the West. And so you see a lot of beans, fava beans and lentils real common. The national dish of Egypt is called ful madames, and that is it's a dish of stewed fava beans mixed with different spices and vegetables, and it's eaten really commonly for breakfast there. Flatbreads, again, something you see real commonly in the Middle East, also real common in Egyptian and Eastern North Africa. And you also see a lot of fruits and vegetables. Lots of melons and cucumbers, onions and garlic are very heavily used with the dishes that cook there, as well as native fruits such as dates and those sorts of things. All right, let's switch our attention to South Africa, Southern Africa, and I say that not to mix it up with the country of South Africa. We're talking about these countries: Botswana, Lesotho, Namibia, South Africa, and Swaziland. As in much of Africa, modern humans have been around for a really long time. We talked about in Northern Africa, civilizations have been around as long as 10,000 years ago. But prior to that, people, as I had previously mentioned, wandered around hunting and gathering for food. And that was before formal civilizations developed. And so modern humans, as you can see from the slide here, have been around for at least 170,000 years in parts of Africa, including Southern Africa. And so as a result of this, there are a lot of tribal indigenous peoples spread throughout Southern Africa. And they include the Khoisan people. The Khoisan people were a group of hunter-gatherers as well as herders. As you can see, the San people, originally semi-nomadic hunter-gatherers. Semi-nomadic meant that they would sort of make temporary settlements and live there for a while, eat from the land, and then move on seasonally to other places where food was available. And the Khoi were herders, tended livestock. So different animals that they would occasionally use for food, or more frequently milk and dairy products. What happened in South Africa is that you had these indigenous people, the Khoisan people, that were other groups moved into them, most notably the Bantu tribes. So Bantu, a lot of Africa is made up of tribal groups. So kind of like when we talk about Native Americans, we talked about the different tribal groups that were dispersed throughout what is now the United States. Well, Africa was really sort of the same thing. You had all these different tribal groups, and they mixed and occasionally warred with each other over resources such as food and water and other territory. The Bantu peoples were more north. They were more Central Africa, and they developed into a large population that dispersed south and eastward. And Bantu tribes include the Zulu and Swazi peoples, which you may have heard of. The thing about the Bantu tribes is that they were herders. In particular, they herded cattle. And so a major part of their diet was dairy, but also beef. They were very heavy beef eaters compared to the rest of native African peoples. And so when they moved south into the area where the Khoisan peoples were, they intermixed and intermingled, and with those native people and brought this tradition of heavy meat eating. We'll talk about in just a minute that there was a heavy European influence because of the land grab that I had mentioned previously, and it may be easy to think that the Europeans were the ones that brought the heavy meat eating habit to South Africa, but it was there before the Europeans showed up because of this Bantu influence. South Africa has a long history of European colonization, primarily by the Dutch and British and Germans. And the earliest European settlements were Dutch. The Dutch established an outpost on the very tip of South Africa for their Dutch East India Company. The spices coming from Southeast Asia and Southeast Asia were worth quite a lot of money. There was big demand for them in Europe at this time because having spices in your food was a status symbol. You could show off how wealthy you were. So wealthy Europeans were really literally hungry to get their hands on spices. And so the Dutch in particular were the first to establish trade routes. So in that process, spices would be taken from South and Southeast Asia. They would be transported overseas, and South Africa provided kind of a nice spot for refueling and reprovisioning of these ships as they came through on their way back up north to Europe. So what happened was the Dutch came in 16th century and claimed these lands for themselves, for the Dutch East India Company. And of course, the Khoisan people were not okay with that. And it triggered a couple of wars between the Dutch and the Khoisan tribes. And eventually, what happened in South Africa is very similar to what we saw happen in the Americas and the Caribbean when Europeans came through at almost a little bit earlier than what was happening here. Is that these old world diseases such as smallpox, to which these native people had no immunity, they killed off large parts of the population, and so the Dutch were able to take these lands for themselves because there were no longer as many people to oppose them in doing that. If you move forward to the 19th century, the Dutch eventually gave up control of this particular area to Great Britain. And a little farther north, the Germans had a big settlement in what is now Namibia. So that's really the history of why there was such a large European settlement in South Africa. And of course, in modern times, that led to policies such as apartheid, where white European settlers were seen to have had more rights and had more freedom than the native black population. And of course, apartheid policies and all of those things came along, and so the roots are in this European colonization of the area. So in terms of worldview, if we look at religion of Southern Africa, because of the heavy European influence, roughly about 80% of the people in South Africa are Christian, and there are pockets of syncretic beliefs which mix Christianity with indigenous beliefs and religions. And then you also see a mixing of Muslims, Hindus, and Jews in the area as well. In terms of healthcare, you see an influence of modern biomedicine, again largely because of the European history in the area, but they're also traditional healers. In the picture here, you see a Sangoma, which is he is a diviner, and what they do is something called throwing bones, which basically it's a collection of not only animal bones, but it might be some other projects like items like shells and coins and rocks and those sorts of things. And what they do is they throw them into the air and then they let them land on the ground. And they basically figure out the answers to questions based on the way these different things land. So it's called divination. The Inyanga is an herbalist, and so like many other parts of the world, herbal medicines and treatment modalities are really common in folk medicine. So those are available as well, and many native South Africans, especially older ones, may be more likely to look at folk remedies, either in place of traditional biomedicine or used in conjunction with traditional biomedicine. So looking at other areas in South Africa, Namibia, as I mentioned, had heavy colonization by the Germans. And as I'd previously mentioned, part of the indigenous culture was cattle farming. So there's a lot of beef here, a lot of dairy products. The Germans, when they came in, brought beer with them. German-style African lager can be found throughout this area. Sausage. So there's a definite German flavor not only to the food and drink, but also the language and the architecture in Namibia. Swaziland and Botswana have a lot of the native indigenous crops. Sorghum is a type of grain that you found very commonly throughout Africa that was eventually replaced with corn once corn was brought back to the Old World from the New World by the Portuguese and the Spanish. A lot of use of goat here in this area, although there is also beef, again, because of that herding, that cattle herding behavior. And lots of dishes made with ground nuts and mashed beans, and that's more of an indigenous way of treating foods. So you see a lot of stews and things like that with a lot of mashed beans and nuts in them. Lesotho is a very small nation that's surrounded by what is today South Africa, the country of South Africa. And you see a little bit more British influence in this area because, again, the British were very active in this area throughout the after the 19th century. And then looking at indigenous foods, as I've been mentioning in the previous slides, sorghum, grains, very, very common. We're going to actually see this throughout a lot of Africa, not just here in the South, but having some sort of a starchy item to eat a stew-like meal with is really common over pretty much East, West, and South Africa. You don't see it in the North quite as much, but having sort of a pounded starch paste like this, what you see here is something called pap. It's called different things in different parts of Africa, but essentially what it is, it's a really stiff starch paste that was originally made from grains like sorghum, or millet in some cases, but this was all replaced by corn. And really what it is it sort of acts as a utensil where you have a ball of starch, as you see in the picture here, that's made of corn, and you pinch some of that off and you dip it in the stew and then you eat the whole thing. So it's really meant to be used as sort of a utensil to consume your meal with, and we'll see this more when we get to Eastern and Western Africa. But that's very common. Lots of wild foraged fruits and vegetables. Pumpkin, you see a lot of squash, especially pumpkin, throughout many parts of Africa, certainly South Africa. Meat, we've already talked about. Beef is very, very important all throughout South Africa because of that Bantu herding tradition that they have. And obviously when you have beef, generally you also have dairy products. And so fermented dairy products, yogurt, fresh milk, things like that are also really common in the indigenous diet. And much of that agreed with the European settlers coming in because, of course, beef and dairy products are also really important parts of their diet as well. We've talked about the European influences on the South African diet. There's also something else to consider, and those are Asian, South Asian, and Southeast Asian influences that were brought not only by the Dutch East India Company. Remember, we talked about the spices being moved through on their way up to Europe. Certainly some of those, anytime you have a trade route where something is going from point A to point B, any stops along the way usually also have access to those foods and those spices. And so there was a little bit of influence on the diet because of those trade routes. But the other thing that really made a difference in adding an East Asian or Southeast Asian flavor to South African cuisine was the use of slaves. And, we saw this in the Americas where slaves brought from Africa brought some of their food traditions and food ingredients with them. The Dutch East India Company also imported slaves from Southeast Asia and South Asia. And really sort of the same thing happened. Slaves from those areas were brought in to do the work of the Dutch East India Company, and they brought their foods and their traditions with them. And so there's a type of sub-cuisine in the area called Cape Dutch, and what that means is it's cuisine that is a mix of the European traditions and the indigenous South African traditions, but also the Southeast Asian influence as well. And so you'll see things like curry powders and curries, and kind of this these Asian flavors that are melding in with the flavors that were already there. And so you'll see curries, you'll see chutneys, you'll see all kinds of different things. The dish that you see there is called boba tea, which is the national dish of South Africa. And it sort of looks like a pie. It's actually kind of like a meatloaf that, so it's ground beef or ground beef is probably the best way to put it, or minced beef. That is flavored with things like curry and bay, and it has kind of that Eastern sort of flavor to it, and it's usually covered with some sort of like an egg wash crust and served. So it's sort of like a I guess maybe an Asian influenced meatloaf might be the best way to categorize boba tea, but it's a marriage of a lot of what the flavor of the area is. The European, Southeast Asian, South Asian, and indigenous traditions as well.